October 3, 1913, Revenue Reform. The Underwood-Simmons Act of 1913 represented a turning point in American fiscal policy. Signed by President Woodrow Wilson, the law marked a significant departure from the long-standing system of high protective tariffs that had dominated the 19th century. It also re-established a federal income tax under the authority of the recently ratified 16th Amendment. Together, these measures reflected a major shift in the federal government's approach to revenue, trade, and the economy. Before 1913, the federal government relied primarily on tariffs for its revenue. Protective tariffs raised prices on imported goods, which shielded domestic industries from foreign competition, but also increased costs for consumers. Farmers and consumers, particularly in the South and West, long opposed these tariffs because they benefited northern manufacturers while raising living expenses nationwide. The Democratic Party, with Wilson as its newly elected president, pledged to reduce tariffs and implement a more equitable system of taxation. The Underwood-Simmons Act substantially lowered tariff rates. It cut the average tariff from about 40% to around 25%. This reduction was one of the most drastic in United States history. The law sought to encourage international trade and reduce the burden on American consumers by making imported goods more affordable. It reflected Wilson's broader vision of a fairer economic system that balanced the interests of producers, consumers, and farmers. At the same time, the act reintroduced a federal income tax, authorized by the 16th Amendment in 1913. The law imposed a 1% tax on personal incomes above $3,000 for individuals and $4,000 for married couples, with graduated rates rising to 6% on incomes over $500,000. Although these rates were modest compared to later standards, the income tax established a permanent framework for federal revenue collection. This new system shifted the tax burden from consumers who paid higher prices due to tariffs to wealthier citizens with higher incomes. The income tax provision was historically significant because it reflected growing support for progressive-era reforms. Reformers believed that wealth should contribute a greater share to public revenue. By linking federal income directly to citizens' earnings, the government secured a more stable and fair source of revenue than tariffs alone. This marked a foundational change in the structure of American public finance that endures to this day. The passage of the act was also a political achievement for President Wilson and the Democratic Party. For decades, attempts to reduce tariffs had met fierce resistance from Republicans and industrial interests. The election of 1912 gave Democrats unified control of Congress and the presidency, allowing Wilson to push through his agenda. The act demonstrated Wilson's effectiveness in rallying support for reform and his commitment to shifting federal policy toward fairer taxation and freer trade. Economically, the immediate effects of the tariff reductions were mixed. Some industries faced greater competition from imported goods, while consumers benefited from lower prices. Over time, the income tax proved crucial to financing expanding federal responsibilities. By the time of World War I, the federal government increased rates dramatically to support military expenditures. Thus, the Underwood-Simmons Act not only introduced the income tax, but also created the framework that allowed the government to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale during crisis. The law's broader legacy lies in its transformation of federal finance. By permanently establishing the income tax as a central revenue source, the act enabled the federal government to expand its role in economic and social affairs throughout the 20th century. The decline of tariffs as the primary source of revenue reduced regional and class conflicts over trade policy and shifted the debate toward questions of fairness and distribution in taxation. The Underwood-Simmons Act of 1913 was therefore a pivotal moment in American history. It reflected the triumph of progressive-era reformers who advocated for lower tariffs and fairer taxation. It strengthened the federal government's financial foundation and altered the balance between consumers, producers, and the wealthy. Its dual legacy of lower tariffs and the federal income tax continues to shape the economic and political landscape of the United States more than a century later. For enthusiasts of historical ephemera, visit history-collectors.com to find collectibles that might complement your collection. You can own a piece of history.